So, there's an upcoming patch at the end of the week. We know that it's coming, and the people at Direwolf Digital have been so very nice as to announce ahead of time what the balance changes are that are coming, because there is an upcoming last chance qualifier for the final Worlds tournament of RNG Eternal. It's not the final tournament, but it is the big one of the year. There's a $5,000 prize pool. The last chance qualifier is tomorrow. I'm already qualified, so I won't be playing in that one. I will be going to a wedding. But nonetheless, we have 7 new card changes to talk about, and that's real exciting because there's actually some pretty good ones. So they have buffed Bart. Yeah, that's what it is. Crazy Kev, a buff. Okay, so here's what we're going with. There have been 7 big changes. There's 1 nerf, 5 buffs, and 1 that is both a buff and a nerf, but is actually there are 2 that are probably both buffs and nerfs, but also definitely improvements on the card, I think. So 6 buffs, 1 nerf. And yeah, it's gonna be real interesting. Should change up the meta a little bit more, making a lot of Omens of the Past cards a lot better. But it looks like Empty Throne is still stable. Nothing has really had to change there. Okay, so Bartholo the Seducer is the first of our cards, and he's the only card that has been nerfed. He has gone up in cost. He is now a 2/2, and his ultimate has actually gone down in cost, which means that you now pay 7 to draw a relic of your choice from your deck. This is actually, this is a little bit of a sideways play, which means that he actually is gonna be more useful in decks that are not currently Bart decks. Being able to grab a relic like Sword of the Sky King or a Zindil's Gift in particular makes Bart a little bit stronger. In different colors of decks, he's going to be in pretty good shape. I think that overall what that's going to do for him is it will make him a little bit more flexible, but because he is no longer the card that you play on 3, put a Lethrai Felchen on 4, he's not going to be quite as dominant in the meta. So Bart decks, Bart aggro is a little bit less powerful. And that's fine, because the deck was a little bit toxic. People didn't like it very much. I think it had a fairly high win rate compared to other Argenport decks in particular. So yeah, Bartholo is getting a minor nerf and a minor little buff to make up for it. I really like this change. Not only does it actually put Bartholo in the position of being kind of a Johnny card, now that he can actually pull that relic at a reasonable level, he's a much more interesting card to me personally. But I also think that it's a reasonable buff for the actual standard meta. So if you're having issues with Argenport decks, then this is the buff or the nerf that you were looking for. Yeah, and that's pretty exciting. Bartholo is definitely a card that probably needed some changes, and I like this change quite a bit. However, the thing about it is that it does disrupt the cycle completely. Bartholo is part of a 5-card cycle, which is a 2, a 3, a 4, I believe a 5 and a 6. Is it 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6? It's Kothan, Vadius. Oh no, Bartholo is not. Okay, so yeah, the numbers on the top don't matter, but the ultimates do, because there is a 6 cost, a 7 cost, an 8 cost, a 9 cost, and a 10 cost ultimate. And now one of those ultimates is a 7 cost, so it's a 6 cost, a 7 cost, a 7 cost, an 8 cost, and a 9 cost. Everything's ruined forever. The Melvins will be extremely sad, and other than that, I think that this is a really good change. So yeah, all right. Next thing, let's go with Becky. All right, Beckoning Lumen. So Beckoning Lumen, which was a 6/4, 4/5, is now a 5/3 for 4 with the same ability. Life Force at the end of your turn. If you gain health, draw a card. This is one of the most interesting balance changes, because it is not just a buff for certain. Going down to 3 health makes you vulnerable to Torch. It makes you vulnerable to a lot of other things. Going down to 5 means you can't trade with Sandstorm Titan, but beyond that, it's not actually too different for Beckoning Lumen, which usually didn't want to trade with Sandstorm Titan anyways. As a 4-drop, however, it is a card that can trade with a lot of other things, and being a lot cheaper, I think, is a lot better for this card. This also puts this card in line with Mask of Torment decks, which means that if you're playing Life Force Mask of Torment, which is a fine deck, you can actually do some cool things with this, and I actually have a Lumen list that I think will really appreciate this change. So I'm pretty excited about this one. That's pretty cool. B-Trend Man, thank you for the host. Really good to see you here. But yeah, I think overall this change is a net benefit for Beckoning Lumen, because the card draw is the most important thing about the card. It is still a card that can trade with a lot of stuff. It is still a card that can trigger 5 power matters things, such as Friendly Wisp and Dawnwalker, and it can do those better now, which means that it actually works in other decks aside from the Life Force deck. It's pretty relevant. But yeah, it's also just like a really reasonable play. I think that like this is a really, really good change for Beckoning Lumen, and overall a net positive. But you will have to watch those like mild changes to her attack and strength values, because they do make her a slightly weaker card that is slightly more capable of getting shut down as an engine. Okay, but yeah, weaker against Praxis in particular, strong against pretty much everything else. Very good in Lights Out Ace's Xenon Interrogator list, and the Mask of Torment lists that I like to run. You've probably seen quite a few of them on my Eternal Brew series. Okay, next, looks like I got Mom. Alright, I've named all of these with like one-syllable things, so... Moment of Creation. I am the happiest clam in the world for this change. I know that like nobody else had any sort of reaction to this change, but Moment of Creation was already a pretty good card in my book, so I'm fairly happy to see it buffed because it was relatively reasonable as in terms of the overall stats that it generated. Playing 2 units that are fairly hard to kill, the Sentinels are colorless, so they are not vulnerable to Annihilate, which means that they are just like slightly more evasive. They can't be cruciated as well now, which is not a big deal, but kind of good stuff. Anyways, these 2 Sentinels with the spell-focused powers means that there are going to be like some pretty good decks that can actually play the card now, particularly Praxis tokens. This card has always worked pretty okay in Praxis tokens with Assembly Line, the Talir's Choice, Rally, Wasps. I can't remember what the Wasp... Is it Swarm of Wasps? Something like Swarm of Bees or something like that. But the one that makes a bunch of humbugs is going to also help out quite a bit here. So yeah, like this one is like actually going to provide a very reasonable pile of stats at 7. It's going to provide it in 2 very large units, which triggers a lot of different things such as Volt of the Praxis and any 5 Power Matters cards. And all you really need to activate these things are Find the Ways and Seek powers, which you should be running in Big Praxis anyways. And you'll probably also be running Torches, Xenon Initiations most likely. So like this is a card that you can actually give some consideration to playing at your top end to generate basically 2 cards of value very quickly in a way that doesn't do anything particularly magical for your deck, but usually allows you to overwhelm your unit with very big units. I would definitely try this card out. You will probably be pleasantly surprised. And All Spells Praxis, much more of a deck now. We'll probably be doing another little demonstration of that deck. Okay, what's the next one? Nose? Nose. Nostrix, Lord of Visions. The 5/7 for 6 flying that was already a pretty good stat line on a good flying unit. Now has a better mentor. Give the student each other copy in your hand and deck +5/+5. Keep in mind you still have to exhaust the target of whatever it is that you're targeting with Nostrix, but if you're doing it on something that is like, say, a... Dawnwalker's my personal favorite, but you can do this on Echo units, you can do this on a lot of really crazy things. You can do this on Clockroaches, because like green, blue, yellow Clockroaches seems really cool. You can do this on Killer units, you can do this on anything that you're going to recur. There's a lot of really interesting options. The Endurance units are the best ones, so in particular, this one goes really well after Kosol Brigade for a very, very strong mid-range Huru list. There's a pretty decent mid-range setup now. There's actually 2 Huru cards that got pretty decently buffed here. So yeah, this is a nutty card, and I think it should be fairly okay. Like, this is a really good stat bonus. Nostrix still doesn't do anything really on the turn that it's played, but it generates enough of an influence on the board and on the like overall presence of the map that this is one to look out for, and I think it will probably see some play as a result. Alright, next up. Purdy. Purify. Okay, so Purify has probably the most interesting change. It was a fast spell for 3. It is now a slow spell for 2. And it says silence a unit and deal 3 damage to it. So this is a net buff, I think, to the card overall. The cost reduction is better than the fast speed, but overall, like, what you're getting out of it is going to be fairly beneficial. This is a torch attached to a silence for only 2 cost. Means that you can just knock out those Dawnwalkers very, very quickly. Most of the time, you're going to be just destroying stuff left and right. Purifier was a little too expensive to play in most Praxis decks. It was only seeing like 1 or 2 of plays when it should be like a very standard card. And the objective here is to increase interaction with other decks and make it so that you can actually do some pretty good stuff. So yeah, like I think that again this is a pretty good net buff to the card. It is more playable as a result, and I think this should actually be a 4 of in probably all of your Praxis decks. This card is like Desert Marshal levels of good right now. It is not a fast spell, but it does do very, very well in any type of Praxis deck that isn't trying to just stretch its power base every turn, which admittedly mid-range Praxis decks are going to have a hard time with that. But if you're playing Friendly Wisps and Temple Scribes, then Purify is going to fit right in on those so that you can also like set up Purify on a turn when you don't have a Sandstorm Titan or something like that. No, it's a really, really good silence, and it's a very solid way for Praxis to have access to silence, which is going to make a lot of other decks very sad, in particular the Haunting Scream archetypes. Not being fast means that you can't answer some cards that you really like to answer, like Recurring Nightmare can be a deck again, I guess. It was never a deck before, but now it will be slightly more of a deck than it was. But overall, like, yeah, you've got another good silence tool added to the card. This is the Fun Police's Fun Gun, and we'll see what kind of effect that has on the meta. I'm not personally interested in this card too much, but I do think that it is a card you play in Praxis at this point. Like, there's no reason not to play it. Shelly. Alright. Sheltering Rider. 4 cost 0/5 instead of a 4 cost 0/4. Same abilities, so that +5 strength when she has an Aegis. Now, one of the things that's really good about Sheltering Rider is that she sticks around as a defensive unit when she has her Aegis popped by any sort of torch or any sort of like removal spell. That's not always that great against like some of the speedy decks, because they can usually just get right past her with like a pummel or something like that. In particular, this is a buff for Huru against Skycrag, because like Huru's gonna have, or Skycrag decks have a lot of like sort of like 2 damage stuff like Piercing Shot and Pummel that they're gonna be using to like attack into Sheltering Rider. But the overall like extra buff does make Sheltering Rider a very scary unit. A 5/5 flyer for 4 is extremely strong, and even if you're popping the Aegis, then you can then refresh that Aegis. Sheltering Rider was already like a fairly relevant card, and I think along with Moment of Creation, these are 2 cards that I think like were very reasonable and are now kind of a little bit pushed. So that's really exciting. This card should be very strong in any sort of Huru mid-range to Huru tempo list, and there are some pretty good card decks that can run it. If you're running good Huru stuff, Sheltering Rider's worth taking a look at. And there's a lot of good stuff in Huru that could definitely be explored. We've got Urska now. Sheltering Rider's a good add to this. Peacekeeper's Prod's really interesting. Like, there are some really cool Huru aggro cards that aren't really being used right now, and Huru has a couple of interesting archetypes that I think could be explored here. So Sheltering Rider is definitely a plus in my book, and I'm down for it. Alright. Vara's Choice. Alright, this one is really interesting. This one went down from 3 to 2, and there were no other changes to it. Silence an enemy unit or put it into its owner's hand. Silence a unit in the enemy player's hand, they discard it. So, this is now a card that does similar things to Treachery at the same time, but also it allows you to bounce units same as Teleport. In fact, better than Teleport in many situations. So, yeah, there's a lot of strength to this card. Not only is it now a really good answer to weapon units, like anything that's using Bloodletter or Lithrai Felchin, Tavrod himself, of course, but it's also a card that really helps you deal with, in particular, Tavrod decks. So if you're having some issues with Argenport, Vara's Choice is a good at least 2 to 4 slot, and it will allow you to get rid of Tavrods out of your opponent's hand, as well as, if you don't find Vara's Choice early, silence the Tavrods later and waste their time for a bit while you set up your probably rather significant Xenon engine, since Xenon has a lot of really good cards. This card, along with Banish, means that Xenon just has amazing removal access at this point. We have Annihilate, we have Vara's Choice, we have Banish, we have so many good choices that I think that, like, it's gonna be a lot of competition for slots, but this is a really huge deal. Varus Choice is a very playable card now, and its ability to make your opponent discard is extremely relevant and actually going to make unit-based decks have a little bit of a difficulty. I kind of want to run this in just like Time, Shadow, Fire with Treachery and be completely shenanigan-y, but like overall the actual discard effect is very, very good. It kills Dawnwalkers, which is always important. I think the biggest loser of this patch is Dawnwalker, because not only did Purify get cheaper and more likely to just kill Dawnwalker outright, but Varus Choice is here, and now you can kill Dawnwalker in different ways. So yeah, no, this card was already playable to a certain extent, and now it is no longer competing in a slot with Banish, and it's just straight good removal. So Xenon Control is a real archetype with this, and I think it's a massive improvement. Overall, like, these 7 balance changes promote a bunch of cards in Omens that we have not seen work out, like, previously. They promote a lot of archetypes in Omens that are really struggling, particularly mid-range Huru. We've seen some Xenon control decks that are like really starting to just get started with Auric Interrogator, and I think that like Varus Choice changes really make that a lot better. We're seeing a lot of support for like Praxis-y token type stuff, which is really interesting. That's a deck list that I think we'll probably see a bit more of. So there's a couple of new deck archetypes that can get introduced into the format as a result. And this is also a net nerf to Argenport because we no longer have access to Bartolo, and a lot of the cool like decision-making cards that we have are going to really help out against those cards. Like, we have better answers to Tavrod, which is always nice, and also like our options are just pretty good against the weapon-based decks. They're pretty good for silencing things that are pretty scary. Like, there's just going to be a bit of a shift in the meta as a result of these cards being buffed and nerfed. So I'm really looking forward to seeing people play these cards in the LCQ. I want to see a Moment of Creation deck get to top 8, so somebody do that for me. But, like, yeah, I think that overall this is a really nice set of changes. It definitely addressed the issues that people were having, and did it very quietly without, like, necessarily having to really significantly nerf some of the interesting cards or the fun cards. Tavrod stays the same, and Tavrod is a really, really fun card for people to play with that, as I've said before, is probably not actually the biggest problem about Argenport midrange, and Argenport midrange is probably not that strong a deck. But what they did choose to nerf was the card that sort of made people very unhappy, and they also managed to do it in a way that kept that card interesting as well. So, like, these 7 changes are all really good decision points, like, as far as I'm concerned. Like, they're very strong buffs. There's nothing super questionable about them. This isn't like the Inspire nerf or anything where it's like, I will kind of miss this card. Like, all of these cards have been changed in ways that I'm more interested in them and not less. And there's new decks that I'm interested in now, and I'm not disinterested in other decks. So I think that means that we're probably really on the right track here as far as buffs and nerfs go, and that's very exciting. So I'm looking forward to a new meta. I'm looking forward to a little bit of a change-up, and I'm looking forward to seeing a bunch more Horus Traverse decks and Omens of the Past decks come out to play. We'll be seeing some pretty cool stuff next month, and I'm delighted to hear about it. So for the YouTube folks, thank you for watching. For the Twitch folks, well, let's get back to some games.